Dominic Cummings, guilty or not guilty? So this is going to be the most forensic look into this topic, and yet it's uploaded probably right when everybody stops caring. But nevertheless, I'm going to look at everything Dominic Cummings said and examine whether it was legally and or morally justified. So don't forget to subscribe.
People will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person. And travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all. These are the only reasons you should leave your home. You should not be meeting friends. If your friends ask you to meet, you should say no. You should not be meeting family members who do not live in your home.
So as we know, the lockdown was announced on the 23rd of March, and we'll get onto the specifics of it later. By the 27th of March, Mr. Johnson announced that he had coronavirus. An hour later, Mr. Cummings was caught running from number 10. By the 30th of March, he'd moved up to Durham to isolate there in his parents' house. By the 31st, police were made aware of Mr. Cummings' trip, confirming that the individual in question was present and was self-isolating in part of the house, but number 10 denied this was the case. On April the 5th, Mr. Cummings was spotted in his father's garden, and between the 30th of March and April the 6th, Dominic Cummings became very ill with coronavirus symptoms. On April the 12th, Mr. Cummings and his wife and child then made a trip to Barnard Castle. April the 12th also happened to be his wife's 45th birthday. By April the 14th, Dominic Cummings was spotted returning to work, entering number 10 with his aide, Cleo Watson. There are reports that Mr. Cummings made a second trip to Durham on April the 19th, but this has been denied. So let's start with the good bits. Under the Civil Service Code, as set out in the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, the code states that a civil servant must act with integrity. And that means putting the obligations of public service above your own personal interest. Honesty, being truthful and open. Objectivity, basing your advice and decisions on rigorous analysis of the evidence. Impartiality, acting solely according to the merits of the case and serving equally well governments of different political persuasions. It lays out their responsibility even further. So, for example, under integrity, it says that they must always act in a way that is professional and that deserves and retains the confidence of all those with whom you have dealings. Dominic Cummings does have the support of most of the cabinet and the Prime Minister, so on this he meets the code. It also states that they should ensure you have ministerial authorization for any contact with the media. Now, this is hard to judge because as a result of this scandal, the media has invaded his space. But apart from the statement he made, which seems to have been authorized by the Prime Minister, there has been no unauthorized contact with the media. Under honesty, it says that you must set out the facts and relevant issues truthfully and correct any errors as soon as possible, which he did in his statements. And it also says to use resources only for the authorized public purpose for which they are provided. So it was not authorized for Dominic Cummings to use a government-driven vehicle or a nanny at any point because it was not for public purposes. It says that you must not deceive or knowingly mislead ministers, Parliament or others. Again, nothing about Dominic Cummings' actions misleads ministers in the judgment of those ministers. We'll get onto the bad parts later. In the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions England Regulations for 2020, Part 6 on restrictions on movement states that during the emergency period, no person may leave the place where they are living without reasonable excuse. But Part I states that one of those excuses is to access critical public services, including childcare or educational facilities, where these are still available to a child in relation to whom that person is the parent or has parental responsibility for or care of the child. In Part M, it states that a reasonable excuse could be to avoid injury or illness or to escape a risk of harm. Dominic Cummings' statement supports that these were the two main reasons for his journey. His statement says, "Around midnight on Thursday the 26th of March, I spoke to the Prime Minister. He told me that he had tested positive for COVID. I suddenly got a call from my wife, who was at home looking after our 4-year-old child. She told me she suddenly felt badly ill. She'd vomited, and I felt like she might pass out. And there'll be nobody to look after the child. None of our usual childcare options were available. They were alone in the house. After briefly telling some officials in number 10 what had happened, I immediately left the building, ran to a car, and drove home. She was ill. She might have COVID, though she did not have a cough or fever. At this point, most of those who I work with most closely, including the Prime Minister himself and others who sit within 15 feet of me every day, either had symptoms and have returned to work or were absent with symptoms. I thought there was a distinct probability that I had already caught the disease. I had a few conflicting thoughts in my mind. First, I was worried that if my wife and I were both seriously ill, possibly hospitalised, there was nobody in London that we could reasonably ask to look after our child and expose themselves to COVID. My wife had felt on the edge of not being able to look after him safely a few hours earlier. I was thinking, what if the same or worse happens to me? There's nobody here that I can ask reasonably to help. The regulations make clear. I believe the risk to health of a small child were an exceptional situation, and I had a way of dealing with this that minimized risk to others. Stories had created a very bad atmosphere around my home. I was subject to threats of violence. People came to my house shouting threats. There were posts on social media encouraging attacks. There were many media reports on TV showing pictures of my house. I was worried that given the severity of this emergency, the situation would get worse, and I was worried about the possibility of leaving my wife and child at home all day and off into the night while I worked in number 10. I thought the best thing to do in all the circumstances was to drive to an isolated cottage on my father's farm. At this farm, my parents live in one house. My sister and her 2 children live in another house, and there was a separate cottage roughly 50 metres away from either of them. My tentative conclusion on the Friday evening was this: if we are both unable to look after our child, then my sister or nieces can look after him. My nieces are 17 and 20. They are old enough to look after him, but also young enough to be in the safest category, and they had extremely kindly volunteered to do so if needed. But I thought if I did not develop symptoms and there is a testing regime in place at work, I could return to work if I tested negative. In that situation, I could leave my wife and child behind in a safe place. Safe in the form of support from family for shopping and emergencies. Safe in the sense of being away from home, which had become a target, and also safe for everybody else, because they were completely isolated on a farm and could not infect anybody. Contrary to some media reports, there are no neighbours in the normal sense of the word. The nearest other homes are roughly half a mile away. So in this scenario, I thought that they could stay there for a few weeks. I could go back to work, help colleagues, and everybody, including the general public, would be safe. So I drove the three of us up to Durham last night, arriving roughly at midnight. I did not stop along the way. When I worked the next morning, Saturday, the 28th of March, I was in pain and clearly had COVID symptoms, including a bad headache and a serious fever. So in conclusion of just the good parts, Dominic Cummings remains a loyal and trusted civil servant with the backing of ministers. He has been, as far as we can tell, honest and truthful in his account and has not unnecessarily used public resources for his own personal needs. He has followed the regulation legislation in attending to childcare and personal safety needs. But let's get on to the bad parts. In the Code of Conduct, under integrity, it states that a civil servant must always act in a way that is professional and that deserves and retains the confidence of all those with whom you have dealings. Scotland Minister Douglas Ross did not have that confidence and resigned. The code also says that you must not misuse your official position, for example by using information acquired in the course of your official duties to further your private interests or those of others. While Mr. Cummings was compliant with the law, he used information from the legislation which furthered his own private interest to travel to his parents' house and undermined the government's main message, which was to stay at home. On objectivity, it states that a minister must not frustrate the implementation of policies once decisions are taken by declining to take or abstain from action which flows from those decisions. Dominic Cummings took action contradicting the spirit of the policies, therefore frustrating the government's process to implement further related policy later. On political impartiality, the code states that you must comply with any restrictions that have been laid down on your political activities. By travelling to Durham and to Barnard Castle, Mr. Cummings did not comply with the restrictions. It says you must not allow your personal political views to determine any advice you give or your actions. Mr. Cummings has made a personal political decision to determine the justification for his long-distance journey. In his statement, he admits it was a personal decision, saying, "I did not ask the Prime Minister about the decisions. He was ill himself, and he had huge problems to deal with. Every day, I have to exercise my judgment about things like this, and decide what to discuss with him. I thought I would speak to him when the situation clarified over coming days, including whether I had symptoms and whether there were tests available. Arguably, this was a mistake, and I understand that some will say that I should have spoken to the Prime Minister before deciding what to do." There is one part in his statement which was travelling not for the purposes of childcare or to escape injury, illness, or risk of harm. He states, "My wife was very worried, particularly given my eyesight seemed to have been affected by the disease. She didn't want to risk a nearly 300-mile drive with our child, given how ill I had been about the journey back. We agreed that we should go for a short drive to see if I could drive safely. We drove for roughly half an hour and ended up on the outskirts of Barnard Castle town. We did not visit the castle. We did not walk around the town. We parked by a river. My wife and I discussed the situation, and we agreed that I could drive safely. We should turn around, go home." This was not a reasonable excuse to leave his residence in Durham. Furthermore, although the legislation does not specify the distance people could travel during the coronavirus lockdown measures, the government information at the time did, saying you should not travel if you are experiencing coronavirus symptoms, which Mr. Cummings clearly was in coming back from Durham, and the government effectively banned all non-essential travel. The Barnard Castle journey was not essential travel. The government even had to clarify this after the police were criticised for taking footage spying on people driving for a short walk. News reports and the government of the time had to clarify that even exercise had to be within the local vicinity and only for 1 hour per day. On the Barnard Castle journey, Mr. Cummings also admits to driving with impaired vision. The Highway Code clearly states that you must tell the DVLA if you've got any problem with your eyesight that affects both your eyes, or the remaining eye if you only have one eye. You could be prosecuted if you drive without meeting the standards of vision for driving. There are no reports that Mr. Cummings told the DVLA, so we can either assume that either he committed a crime or he is lying. Mr. Cummings has admitted to driving in an unsafe manner, and while we can't prosecute him because we can't prove his vision at the time, the excuse that he was driving to test his vision doesn't justify the journey he made. It seems more plausible that the trip was made as it was his wife's birthday. Dominic Cummings has lost the confidence of a minister. He disobeyed the spirit of the legislation and travelled further than was essential. The political interpretation of the rules was used in contradiction to the messages being put out by the government, and that therefore frustrated and undermined any future policy or information. He made a completely unnecessary and borderline illegal trip to Barnard Castle and has since made an implausible excuse. I believe that Dominic Cummings had no other option but to travel to his parents' house in Durham to ensure his child was cared for in the event of serious illness. But I don't believe that the Barnard Castle journey was justified given the circumstances. As he, at the time of making this video, has the support of the Prime Minister and most of the Cabinet, it seems unlikely that he will be asked to resign. But I find him guilty. I'll let you make your own conclusions in the comments below, but also don't forget to subscribe.